In August of 2011, Blake and 6 friends headed to his family's remote Wisconsin cabin for what should have been just a carefree weekend. However, only hours later, creeping dread began to take hold. But the true terror waited until 2 in the morning when he nearly came face to face with the unthinkable. In today's episode, I'm going to be telling you 3 eyewitness encounter stories that are going to make you rethink twice about ever going camping or hiking. You won't want to miss this one. On August 19th, 2011, around noon, Blake was loading camping gear into his pickup truck. It was a hot August day, and he kept having to wipe the sweat from his forehead as he packed everything up. And there were 7 people going on his camping trip. They were all heading to this piece of land that Blake's family had owned in Wisconsin. It was just a small cabin next to a lake, so nothing too fancy, but he just drove his pickup truck behind his older brother's SUV, and he would occasionally check his rearview mirror just to make sure all the camping gear he had loaded was still secure and none of it had fallen out. And so after hours of driving, Blake was ready to finally get out and just stretch his legs. They arrived at the property around closer to 3 in the afternoon and immediately began unloading everything. The cabin itself stood in the middle of the property, and it was a bit weathered but still fairly sturdy. It had been in their family for generations, but they didn't actually sleep in it. They mainly just used it for storage and as a shelter in case the weather got really bad. And everybody pitched in, carrying tents and coolers and sleeping bags from the vehicles to the campsite. Blake's older brother took charge and directed where each tent should be set up. And so finally, by about 4 or 4:30, they had pretty much everything ready. They had set up 4 tents in a semicircle facing the lake with a fire pit in the center. But because of the time of year, it was like 85 degrees outside, and Blake's older brother suggested they all go for a swim. And as you can imagine, the water felt absolutely incredible after all that work setting up the camp, and afterwards they just laid out on towels, just letting the sun dry them as they talked about random stuff that they had done that summer. Now, as evening approached, Blake's older brother started the campfire while he and his friends gathered more firewood nearby. And they did all the typical camp stuff, right? They cooked hot dogs and burgers on this portable grill that they had brought, and they passed around bags of chips and drinks. And as it got darker, they could finally see the stars beginning to appear in the sky overhead. And it gets to about 10:20 p.m. and they started making s'mores, and someone in the group suddenly just pointed upward. And there was this brilliant blue light, and it was actually streaking across the night sky, and it was so bright that it had the entire area lit up for like a second or two. And everybody just stopped mid-conversation to watch it until it faded from view. None of them were sure what it was, until Blake's older brother piped up and said that it was probably just a meteor. And everyone agreed, and it was pretty cool to have seen it. And after a little while longer of sitting by the fire, just lost in conversation, people began trailing off to bed one by one. Blake's younger brother was sitting across from him, close to his girlfriend, just talking quietly by the fire, and he was getting tired but wasn't quite ready for sleep yet. He turned to his girlfriend and was about to suggest they head to their tent for some privacy. But mid-sentence, something caught his eye over the tree line on the far side of the lake. And he stood up so quickly that he knocked over his camp chair, and he began pointing at what he was seeing. Now, his girlfriend immediately asked him what was wrong, but she followed his gaze across the water. Both Blake and his younger brother just called for their older brother, who just kept saying, "I'm busy, leave me alone, go away." And after calling again and insisting it was important, his brother emerged from his tent looking irritated. But the moment his brother saw what he was pointing at, his expression completely changed. And now all of them are now saying to each other, "What the hell is that thing?" All fully alert. Hovering just above the lake's surface was an object unlike anything they'd ever seen before, and it moved silently, drifting slowly from one side of the lake to the other, and the object emitted this soft glow that illuminated the water directly beneath it. But the most striking thing was the complete absence of sound. There was no humming, there was no engine noises, And by now, everybody in their camp group had come out of their tents and were watching. Acting quickly, Blake's brother sprinted to his SUV and came back with a pair of binoculars. And he's looking through them, and he could see that the object didn't have any real distinguishing features. It was just this almost solid glowing form hovering there. And for about 2 or so minutes, they all just watched this thing slowly glide across the lake. And suddenly, it's like a light switch just got turned off. It was gone. There was just complete darkness, and except for a faintly glowing circle on the water surface, I mean, that's it. And within a minute, even that faded completely, leaving them all just staring into darkness. And you can imagine just how stunned this entire group of people were, because for several minutes after, I mean, nobody really said a word. It even took a couple moments for them to really regain any composure, and then they just kind of all looked at each other in complete disbelief, convincing themselves internally that what they just saw had been some sort of dream or hallucination of some kind. Now, Blake's older brother just suggested that it might have just been a ball of lightning or maybe an odd weather phenomenon of some kind, and they happened to be lucky enough to witness it. But you could tell that the entire group didn't buy it. In fact, Blake's girlfriend was visibly shaken, and she did not leave his side for the rest of the night. It's all the entire group could talk about for another hour or so before finally going to bed. Now, eventually, even through the adrenaline, Blake managed to drift off to sleep around midnight or so with his girlfriend curled up beside him. And at about 2 a.m, he woke up uncomfortable and needed to shift positions. And, he opened his eyes and just enough to see that the campfire was still smoldering, so there's just a little bit of light, and noticed that one of the battery-powered lanterns was still on. He just figured one of his brothers must have left it on by accident, or that one of them was still out there, maybe sitting by what remained of the fire. And as he quickly sat up, he looked down and checked his phone and saw that it was a few minutes past 2. And he kind of chuckled to himself because he was just going to get up and turn the lantern off and, maybe go pee and come right back to bed. And as he stirred and started to get up, he saw a shadow pass by his tent, and then a second, and then a third, and then a fourth, all in a line. And immediately, he knew that these shadows were not his brothers because the shapes were very different from the physique of his brothers. The figures, they were extremely gaunt, they were thin, really long arms that kind of hung down past the knees, and they moved very deliberately around the campsite, kind of just examining things. And obviously, he froze, right? I mean, he's listening very intently, and he couldn't really hear anything other than just these soft shuffling sounds as he could sense that they were moving between the tents. And so he just held his breath, terrified that they might decide to look inside. Fortunately, his girlfriend was fast asleep beside him, completely unaware of what was going on. And that thought trail was broken when he felt something run the outside fabric of his tent. It was a hand or a finger tracing the material. The touch was pretty light but very deliberate, moving from one side of the tent to the other, and he just closed his eyes, praying that they would leave him alone without getting into his tent. And for roughly 10 to 15 minutes this went on, and he was just stuck, frozen. Eventually, he heard them moving away from his location, and it appeared that they had left in the same formation they had arrived, which appeared to be single file, one after another. Blake was just too terrified to get up from the comforts of his tent to really investigate, having no idea what awaited him out there in the darkness. I mean, after all, it could have been an ambush or something worse. And about 10 minutes more goes by, and Blake can see something. There's like a flash of lightning, and then thunder rumbling off in the distance, and then there's more thunder, and more thunder, but each time it's getting closer. And within only 5 or so minutes, rain began pounding against his tent and campsite. And I can only imagine how fast his mind must have been racing, just trying to find a logical conclusion to all of this, but there's none. And it took quite a while for the adrenaline to leave his body enough to where he could finally fall back asleep. Now, fast forward to early the next morning, and he heard his older brother's voice outside his tent, and he was calling Blake, asking if he was awake yet. And as Blake stirred, he's like, "Hey, did you guys move stuff around last night? Me and Cassie heard a bunch of commotion going on out here." Is everything all right? And without responding, Blake just got up out of his tent and looked around, and the campsite was rifled through. The coolers had been moved, chairs were rearranged, gear was scattered around, but his brothers just assumed raccoons had gotten into their campsite during the night. Blake couldn't really say much because the thoughts of last night were so fresh in his memory. He just kind of took a deep breath and told everybody who was now awake and sitting around the campfire what he had seen. Now, obviously, everybody listening was pretty skeptical, and they just tried to tell him that it was probably a bad dream brought on by the beer and campfire food and, of course, the strange light they saw. No one seemed willing to consider that what he saw might have been real. After breakfast, Blake walked around the perimeter of their campsite, just wanting to double check things. And near the edge of the woods, he found something very strange. A perfect circle where the grass was flattened. It was about 6 feet in diameter, and every blade of grass was pushed down in a clockwise pattern. So he called the others over to look at it, and his older brother knelt down to examine it, kind of just touching the flattened grass with a puzzled expression, and just tried to calm everyone by saying that it's probably where an animal bedded down for the night. Oddly enough, he said it in a way where he was trying to convince himself of that. Fortunately, the rest of their camping trip just went on without any issues, and they all returned home safely 3 days later. However, there's a twist to the story. Blake got a Facebook message from his younger brother who sent him a link to a local news article about a farmer. And he just told Blake to read it, that this is wild, you gotta check this out. So Blake, not really thinking much, just clicked on the link and he began to read, and what he read really upset him. This farmer, who lived not even 5 miles away from the area that they had camped at, was complaining about copious amounts of dead livestock that he had been finding over the past month. These animals all had no visible wounds or any sign of struggle. There was no blood, but most disturbingly is that they had been arranged in a perfect circle. And within days, that article was removed from the website. To this day, he still doesn't know if anyone believes what he saw that night, or if what he saw was even real, or maybe it truly was something supernatural. Sadly, it remains a mystery. On the 4th of July weekend in 2023, Valerie, a camper, had pulled into a familiar spot in Tuskegee National Forest in East Alabama. This was a place that she had been camping at for the past couple of weeks with her fiancé, but this time she was all alone. She had arrived around 7:30 and immediately started rushing to set up before she lost daylight. And the campsite that she had set up was positioned in this kind of small area that was between valleys, and her tent door was facing her vehicle, which was pulled just off to the side of the road. So looking out from the tent, there was this almost kind of shallow valley that led to some really thick trees, and behind her camp was a similar valley with another tree line. And if you look to the left, there was a slight slope where the road disappeared into the trees. To the right, you could see about half a mile of brush in this winding dirt road that went uphill. So basically, this camper was in a small clearing completely surrounded by forest on all sides. And as she set up camp, she could hear some of the other campers off to the left. Now, these folks were just riding four-wheelers, playing music and drinking, just being really rowdy and, unfortunately, inconsiderate. Pretty normal stuff you got to deal with if you're camping anywhere near other people. And after being exhausted from her day, she settled into her tent around 8:15 or so, and she just watched a few videos on her phone before laying down to sleep right around 9. And eventually, she fell asleep. Now, at some point, she woke up briefly, maybe more than once. It was more like twice during the night because the neighboring campers were just really loud. But she did not let that bother her and stop her from enjoying her little outing. And then she was woken up a third time. It was right around 1:45 in the morning. But this time, though, instead of being woken by the campers being noisy, she's just rolling over trying to get comfortable. But she realizes something that wasn't making any sense. It was this short, strange kind of whooping sound that was coming from the left just inside the tree line. Hearing a sound like that really startled her, and so she started listening closer, and she realized just how quiet things were. She could no longer hear the other campers who were just rowdy and making noise not that long ago. And so she's thinking, okay, maybe this is a coyote. I'm out here in the forest. I don't know what this could be. I've never heard this sound before. And after going through the mental Rolodex of animals, she's like, all right, it's either got to be a bird or a fox. And she laid there for probably about 10 or so minutes, just trying to force herself back to sleep. But then off in the distance, heard the sounds of dogs barking from the right, kind of up on top of the hill. So she thought to herself, all right, I guess I'll stay awake just a little bit longer just to maybe monitor the dogs, wondering if these dogs were going to approach her camp. But eventually, the dogs moved further away, and everything got quieter. So she went back to trying to get comfortable and fall back asleep, and at this point noticed that it was completely silent now. And it wasn't just the kind of quiet where, nighttime quiet. It was, her gut was screaming at her that things were not okay. I mean, her stomach was in knots. And by this point, she had heard absolutely nothing for like 30 minutes. But instinctively, she felt like she was being watched. Suddenly, a crunching sound was coming from just to the right of the camp, right outside the closest cluster of trees. She sat up, trying not to make any sudden movements because if there was somebody coming to investigate her camp, she didn't want them knowing that she was awake. It could be someone coming to rob her or worse. And so she just strained to listen and identified the sounds, hoping that, if it was somebody approaching, maybe she could just shout out and let them know that she was armed. But she couldn't tell if it was crunching wood or bone, and whatever it was, regardless, the situation was terrifying. She was simply too scared to look outside the tent, so she quietly began searching for her phone and car keys. And then that same crunching sound started coming from the left side of the camp too, and this new sound was noticeably louder and closer than the first one. Breaking silence again was this nearby owl that suddenly began screeching and screaming. The owl's sudden alarm really intensified her fear, and now she's at a point where she realized that things were escalating quickly and she needed to be ready in case things got bad. Whoever was out there obviously had ill intent, and so she grabbed her pistol, disengaged the safety, and now the crunching sounds were coming from multiple directions simultaneously, from left, from the right, and from behind. Folks, she was surrounded. She described it as sounding like bones or thick wood being chewed on, and deciding that she had no choice and had to leave, she put her phone in her pocket, grabbed her keys, chambered around in the pistol, and very slowly and cautiously opened the tent door. She was ready to make a run for it as fast as she could. And the moment that she emerged from the tent, all the crunching sounds stopped. It was just sudden, complete silence. But then a new sound began, and it was what sounded like human weeping. But it was coming directly across the road in front of her camp. And it was this really animalistic sounding voice that clearly intentionally mimicking human crying. It actually reminded her of the scene in Harry Potter where Professor Lupin transforms into a werewolf. And in that moment, her fight or flight kicks in. She doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't care. It's either do or die. And so she just takes off into a full-blown sprint back to her car that she can see, all while trying to stay alert to any noises around them. And so she reaches the car, she throws the door open, she jumps inside, she slams the door, she locks the car, and she's running through all of her options now. Does she turn the car on? Does she drive back home? What does she do? Does she leave everything behind? Well, no, because all of her belongings and valuables are there, like her wallet and other expensive equipment. So leaving right now isn't an option. And so just after battling with herself for a good few minutes, she realizes that she's just going to try to do her best and stick it out until morning, until she can go out there, strip everything down, pack up, and go. And even through the remainder of the night, they could still hear the strange random noises here and there, and all of them alluding to her invisible guests close by. Unfortunately, whoever or whatever it was that had visited her campsite that evening remains inconclusive. The morning of October 8th, Trenny Gibson woke up, got dressed in jeans, a blue blouse, and this blue and white striped sweater. She put on her favorite jewelry, this diamond and star sapphire ring that she really loved, And while she was eating breakfast, she chatted with her brother Bob, who was home on leave from the Navy. It was actually a pretty chilly and rainy morning. And so on that drive to school, Trenny saw another student walking and rolled down her window to ask if the field trip was still happening. She was kind of surprised it hadn't been canceled due to the bad weather. And so Trenny had her lunch packed for the trip, but she left her purse and all of her school books in her mother's car. She didn't even bring a coat with her, thinking that they might just stay inside at school because of the rain. At school, Trenny boarded the bus with 38 other students, and she sat in the back with a senior named Robert Simpson, who was a friend of her brother's. Before leaving home that morning, Bob had actually asked Robert to keep an eye on his sister during the trip. And this was a bit unusual because Trenny hadn't really been away from her family for an entire day before. The teacher, Wayne Dunlap, had kept their field trip destination a secret just to build up excitement among the students, because it was only after everyone was seated on the bus that he announced they were going to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And the students were very excited because this was a much better trip than they had ever expected. They'd actually be hiking to a place called Clingman's Dome, and it's actually the highest peak in the Smokies. The bus arrived at the parking lot around noon, and it was still pretty chilly and rainy with misty fog hanging over the mountains. Trenny was visibly shivering because she didn't have a coat, so Robert Simpson just let her his brown, orange plaid wool jacket. Wayne Dunlap gathered everyone together for instructions and explained that they'd be hiking the Forney Ridge Trail to a place called Andrews Bald and then back. Everybody needed to be back on the bus by 3:30 p.m. at the latest. The students were told to not take any side trails or disturb any plant life. Mr. Dunlap had them all raise their hands to confirm they understood these rules. Great. Then the group spread out, naturally breaking into smaller clusters based on who was friends with who walked at similar speeds. Trenny and Robert hiked together down the trail, and the Forney Ridge Trail descends from near the summit, going through this really dense forest. It kind of has these steep drop-offs and thick undergrowth on either side, and the trail was really wet and slippery that day because of all the rain. And about 1.8 miles from the parking lot, Trenny and Robert reached Andrews Bald. This was basically a grassy clearing at roughly 5,920 feet elevation. Normally, the view from there would be spectacular, but that day it was just all shrouded in mist and rain. So Trenny and Robert just sat down and ate their packed lunches. After they finished eating, it was right around 1:30 p.m. and Trenny explained to Robert that she wanted to head back to the bus and she wasn't having as much fun as she had wanted. Robert understood and said that he actually wanted to stay longer at the Bald. So Trenny, still wearing Robert's jacket, just started back on her own. And as Trenny headed back up the trail toward the parking lot, she passed several groups of her classmates who were still heading down to Andrews Bald. She first caught up with a group that included Angela Beckner, Lisa Mickles, and Bobby Coghill. Bobby briefly walked with Trenny since she was moving faster than her friends, and then they caught up with another small group that included Scott Troy and Anita Rounds. Trenny walked with them for about 5 minutes until the group stopped to rest. But Trenny was cold, she was miserable, it was really wet outside. She just explained she didn't want to stop, that she would just rather keep going. And at this point, they were about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile from the parking lot, and up ahead, there was another group of students who had also stopped to rest, and they saw Trenny coming and invited her to join them, but she just declined again because she really wanted to get to a place where she could be warm and dry. And so this group watched as she suddenly stopped and crouched down on the trail. And she appeared to be looking at something interesting off the right side of the path. Then she stepped off the trail, heading downhill into dense vegetation. But then, moments later, another student named David was coming up the trail, and he saw that there were no signs of Trenny. And they were calling her name, but there was no response. There was a small creek running nearby, but they didn't hear any splashing or movement, and so they just figured that she had just gone ahead of them somehow, that maybe she cut through the forest as kind of a shortcut to get back to the bus. So they're all just like, you know what, she probably beat us there. They just continued to the parking lot. Everyone expected that Trenny would be waiting for them, but by 3:40 p.m., most of the students had returned to the bus, but Trenny wasn't among them. Mr. Dunlap then started asking if anyone had seen her. Robert Simpson returned by this point, and he said that he'd hiked to Andrews Bald with Trenny, but that she'd left to head back while he had stayed behind. And according to Robert, he'd spent some time tracking a bear after Trenny left. No one had hiked back with Robert, so there wasn't anyone who could verify his story. As minutes continued to pass, concerns started to grow, and Wayne Dunlap and another student actually hiked back to Andrews Bald looking for Trenny, but there was no sign of her anywhere. And about 4:30 rolls around, and a park ranger named Sammy Lale arrived in the parking lot. After being briefed on the situation, he began searching the area, specifically the Andrews Bald area himself, but there was nothing. And so he decided he was going to file an official missing person report. And that's when the National Park Service launched a search op. Meanwhile, the bus with all the other students returned to Knoxville. Strangely, many of them believed that Trenny had simply run off with someone and that this wasn't really a serious situation. But National Park Service employees from both Tennessee and North Carolina realized that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a very dire situation. And by evening, conditions had become extremely challenging with more rain, wind, and fog. And around 8 p.m., Hope Gibson received the phone call that no parent wanted to get, that her daughter was missing in the vast wilderness of the Smokies. After Trenny's father, Robert Gibson Sr., returned from a business trip to Louisiana, the parents drove to the park themselves, and they brought clothing that Trenny had recently worn to try and give scent to the tracking dogs. They arrived around midnight, desperately hoping to get good news. And the search continued until about 3 a.m. when poor weather forced them to suspend operations. All night, you can imagine how much anxiety and terror the Gibsons dealt with as they waited, just imagining their poor daughter alone in the cold, dark mountains. Now, on the next day, October 9th, a full-scale search op began at first light. You had 6 dog teams with bloodhounds and German shepherds who were also deployed. A ranger by the name of Jack Linehan had coordinated all the search and rescue efforts, and you had a road between the Clingman's Dome parking area and Newfound Gap was now closed to the public. The search was actually pretty dangerous because one searcher fell and broke several ribs, and every inch of the trail from the parking area to Andrews Bald was thoroughly examined. Trenny's uncles even joined in on the search with their own dogs. You had National Guard helicopters that were brought in, but they couldn't fly until late afternoon just because of how much fog there was. And just the combination of haze and thick foliage and, fallen leaves, it made the search very, very difficult. The only silver lining in these black clouds, no pun intended because of the storms, were a few broken ferns that were found on the trail kind of close by to where Trenny was last seen, but there was really nothing conclusive there. But they did find 3 cigarette butts and a half-empty can of beer nearby. Tracking dogs picked up Trenny's scent at the intersection with the Appalachian Trail, and they followed it past the Clingman's Dome observation tower. And some of the dogs detected the scent along the roadside about 1.5 miles from Newfound Gap, but then something strange happened. The scent trail suddenly stopped, as if Trenny had just vanished from that spot. The following day, 8 cigarette butts of the same brand were found at that exact location. It was almost like someone had been waiting there. And the search for Trenny continued all the way until October 22nd, 1976. A limited search remained in effect until November 2nd. And in total, you had over 750 people, all of who had searched for Trenny in some capacity. The search was officially called off because there was just simply no physical evidence ever suggesting, as crazy as this is, that she was ever in the park. That she was still in the park. However, park staff still remained vigilant and they stayed alert for any signs during their regular duties, but there were none, even going into winter. The following spring, Robert Gibson Sr. organized another search. You had 230 people who spent 2 weeks searching every trail, drainage, and ridge, every nook and cranny within a 15-mile radius. all the area between Andrews Bald and Elk Mount in Tennessee, which is roughly 15 miles. The chief ranger just told reporters that he was almost certain she was never in the park to begin with. But on October 11th, while the search was still going on, Trenny's parents revealed a troubling incident. A year prior, a Bearden High student named Kelvin Bowman had tried to break into their home. Hope Gibson had shot him in the foot, and he was arrested. And he was sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile facility, but he had only served 6 months. By the time of Trenny's disappearance, he was back at the high school. And even during his court hearing, Kelvin had allegedly threatened to harm Trenny when he got released. Some students claim they saw Kelvin following the high school bus to the mountains that day, but the school principal, Frank Hall, insisted that Kevin was in class and that Wayne Dunlap denied seeing any cars following the bus at all that day, and that he was never actually there. Of course, rumors circulated that Kelvin and Trenny might have been in a relationship at some point, but it's pretty unclear. This would have been very controversial in the 1970s in Tennessee, just, due to all the racial differences, but some people wondered if Trenny had arranged to meet him in the park. Robert Simpson's behavior raised a lot of questions as well. I mean, he was a year older and seemed very fond of her, and they often went on short rides together in his car. But after she vanished, he visited the Gibson home, and he told Trenny's younger sister, Tina, flat out that if Kelvin Bowman has Trenny, he will kill her. If he doesn't have her, he thinks she might have run off with some horny hitchhiker, which was pretty odd from someone who supposedly cared about her. But the FBI began investigating her disappearance on October 12, 1976, and their case file was never released to the public. So what did they discover in their investigation? Did they find evidence pointing to something like foul play, or did they determine that she had left voluntarily? Without access, these questions remain unanswered. When she did disappear, she was wearing a star sapphire pendant and ring. These were Christmas and birthday gifts that she really treasured. Sometime after her disappearance, the items were found in the possession of another Bearden High sophomore. But the girl could not satisfactorily explain how she came to have them. How did Trenny's jewelry end up with this student? Did Trenny give these items to her before vanishing, or did someone else give them to this girl after Trenny vanished? We don't know. There are really two main theories about what happened. The first is that she was abducted, and some believe that she might have been taken where Andrews Bald Trail intersects with the Appalachian Trail. Perhaps she was hidden somewhere, like in a storage area, or who knows. And from there, she could have been taken to the spot on the road where the dogs lost her scent and then removed from the park by vehicle. But the second theory is that she voluntarily vanished. One of her friends, Kim Pouncey, would later say that somebody was waiting for her and that there was a parking lot very close by, and that she always had a feeling that Trenny just planned the whole thing, but that was her way out. Which, if that is the case, would be interesting because she had left her purse in her mother's car, and she had $200 in her drawer at home and $1,000 in her bank account, none of which she took or accessed, or at least tried to access. Not to mention, she left the trip without a jacket and had to borrow one. So if she was planning to run away, why would she hike all the way to Andrews Bald and back first? Why not just leave from the parking lot? Additionally, she was supposedly taking antibiotics for a foot injury at the time, so again, it just doesn't make sense. Such an event would definitely inflict a lot of trauma on a family. The Gibsons did everything they could to keep their family together, but they would sell their home and move to a new neighborhood to try and escape the painful memories as time went on, but, the loss eventually just took its toll. The parents eventually divorced, and Trenny's older brother, Robert Jr., the Navy sailor who'd asked his friend to watch over his sister, died in 2000 at 42 years of age. Her father, Robert Sr., passed in 2004 at 67. Her sister, Tina, died in 2016 at 54. And what began as the disappearance of one teenager led to the entire dissolution of a family. And unfortunately, even today, more than 45 years later, she still remains missing. There's been no body, there's been no confession, no resolution, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is no closer to harboring any sort of answer as to what happened that day. And because you guys made it to the end, I want you to all comment below, "Let's go hiking," so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural in a kind of cinematic storytelling fashion, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.